It happened as predicted. A far-left socialist candidate who has vowed to take illegal dictatorial action is now the mayor-elect of the most populated city in the U.S. Of course, most of the big mainstream media is not telling you what this means and why it's so dangerous for the entire country. Fortunately, Newsweek invited me to weigh in. Ahead, I'll share with you the facts that I provided there. Facts that disprove the celebratory narrative filling the disastrous New York Times and other major outlets. Speaking of the Times, they had another oops moment. Their UN bureau chief posted a tweet that showed her bias. I'll explain. But today, a bigger question. How did we get here? How did the mainstream media usher in an era in which it screams about the very real dangers to democracy coming from the right, while running cover for the very real dangers to democracy coming from the left? How did the media get to this level of historic, epic failure? Someone joins me to discuss this, a really interesting figure in the media, Mike Pesca, host of what he says is the longest-running daily news podcast. He and I are both NPR alums, and today we talk through steps that led the news media away from journalistic principles and deeply into left-wing activism. It's stuff I have not yet addressed on this show. Also, as part of it, we'll discuss another way that the media helped Mamdani win. To understand that, we're going to be looking at a whole other story, the killings of Asian women in the Atlanta area. You'll hear why that is significant now. Mike also has his own very telling story. He got fired from what was a popular news agency for a preposterous reason. It says so much about backward thinking in newsrooms and left-wing radicalization, and how you're not even allowed to discuss certain issues in the news with colleagues unless you conform to their anti-journalistic views. Yup, literally. Also today, your awesome responses to last week's episode about the demolition at the White House and some ideas about how to find optimism even when the news seems to suck. That and more coming up on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So great to have you. I'm Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. You can learn about me at my website, joshlebs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. You can see my bio and all sorts of good stuff there. You'll see that I spent 20 years in mainstream media and became the lead on-air fact-checker at CNN, but I always saw how badly the media itself needs fact-checking. So much is published and aired that is just not accurate. I love hearing from listeners and readers to the newsletter. There's a newsletter that comes along with this show. It's free. You can find it through the link in the show notes or at my website. And while it is free, a great way to support this show is to become a paid subscriber. Then you get extra content, including annotated hyperlinks, transcripts, and more. I like checking in on what listeners and readers are saying. Let's see, after last week's episode, when I talked about the demolition at the White House and plans for a ballroom, I also wrote about this for a site called The Contrarian. Let's see, Ruth wrote, "We used to get balance, fairness, and context with our news. We should demand it again. Recommend subscribing to Josh Lebs, They Stand Corrected. Lies, half-truths, and decontextualization are driving outrage on both sides. Even the assumption that every issue must break down on partisan lines is dishonest and unnecessarily inflammatory." Thank you, Ruth. I really appreciate that and the fact that you are following. All right, on to today's episode. This week, we're releasing the episode a day later than usual. I wanted to hold it by one day just so I can at least weigh in on initial coverage of the election. As I record this, the off-year elections just happened. There were a bunch of them. It's nowhere near as big a story as the even-year elections, but there were some significant ones. And a promise I have made to you is that I will not be all about hot takes. There's way too much of that in our society as it is. I will take time to analyze so we get some depth and thought, and most importantly, fact-checking. In the coming days, I will be analyzing coverage of multiple races. So send me your questions and feedback. I usually say this at the end, but I'll tell you now, there are two great ways to reach me. The best is through the newsletter. Everyone can read it, but paid subscribers can message me there. And there's also a way for any listener to reach me. There's a really cool form at my website, joshlevs.com. So, okay, a lot of you, though, immediately asked me about the New York City mayoral race. I have reported on the dangers of Zohran Mamdani, who won as predicted. Newsweek invited me to weigh in. I wrote that this marks a terrible, dangerous turn in U.S. politics. I traced readers through my coverage of his disturbing candidacy, his hypocritical threat to conduct an unconstitutional arrest, which is a move straight out of the dictator's playbook. Also, how he expresses his love for convicted funders of Islamist terrorism and his frequent anti-Semitic libel. I wrote, every public official who supported Mamdani has lost the right to complain when Trump or any other right-wing leaders engage in unconstitutional behaviors or trade in anti-Semitism. Most big mainstream media have been deeply in Mamdani's camp. I've shared a bunch of examples in previous episodes. If you haven't heard, I encourage you to go back. But here's the latest oops, I did it again moment from the New York Times. That's a great song, by the way. Anyway, if you were to write a fictional script based on reality about how the media and the United Nations are both so deeply in the far-left pro-Islamist camp, you might create, as a main character, the New York Times UN bureau chief. Who would better represent the confluence of both? Well, here in the real world, the New York Times UN bureau chief is Farnaz Fasihi. She tweeted in celebration after Mamdani's victory. Mayor Mamdani! Exclamation point. NYC! Exclamation point. Eventually, she pulled it and replaced it with just the subdued message, Zohran Mamdani mayor-elect. No exclamation points. But why bother? The mask has slipped at the New York Times so many times. We already know what's underneath. But while I have brought you other examples in the past, there is another way in which the Times and other big mainstream media have run cover for him throughout the race. So here's the deal. I was interviewing Mike Pesca, host of the podcast The Gist. He does interviews about news subjects. More on him coming up. But there's something he brought up that's really significant now. Here's the background. If you've listened to this show, then you know accusations that Israel carried out genocide in Gaza are false. And it's not complicated. Words have definitions. And that's not what this was. The Nation of Ireland and Amnesty International both acknowledged in writing that the existing definition does not cover what they want genocide to now be called. Anyway, Mike lives in New York, and he was talking to me about how Mamdani has been pushing the genocide lie.
It's just become so normal for everyone in good standing in society to say the genocide of the Gazans, the genocide in Israel. Israel's responsible for genocides. We've then become very trendy to say it, as one would apply a sociological term, not a legal term. And when the next mayor of New York City says it, but then also says in his next breath, and let's bend over backwards and take him for his word that he really, really wants Jews not to be attacked. And he really, really wants identifiable skullcap wearing members of Chabad not to be attacked. Those two things are at odds with each other. If you are breathing into the world this lie, as you say, about genocide, who's going to bear the brunt of those lies? And I'm not only talking about insane people taking messages in a way that you can't anticipate or that is regrettable if you say true things and the insane act upon it. I'm talking about motivated people who think they're doing the right thing and they're violent and they're nasty, but genocide is one of the reasons that they're motivated to go out and attack a person. So take that into account. But it's hard for someone who's raised in the ideological milieu that Mamdani was raised in not to say it.
It's true. Mamdani says he really wants Jews to be safe, but he also keeps pushing that lie and has every reason to know what people will do with that lie. People entrenched in mainstream media and ideologies of the far left have a very hard time seeing this, or can't see it at all. But journalism should apply the same rules always. So I'm going to pull out of this story now and take you to another one. In early 2021, a gunman in the Atlanta area, where I live, killed 8 people. 6 of them were Asian women. Attacks on Asian people were spiking throughout COVID. When this happened, the Biden administration had just come into office. The media had no problem linking this attack to remarks that Trump had made during his presidency. Here's CBS.
The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki addressed Tuesday's shootings in Atlanta at her press briefing yesterday. I want to play some of what she had to say.
I think there's no question that some of the damaging rhetoric that we saw during the prior administration, blaming, calling COVID the Wuhan virus or other things, led to, perceptions of the Asian American community that are inaccurate, unfair, has elevated threats against Asian Americans. And we're seeing that around the country.
Trump had said during his presidency that he did not want to see any violence against Asian Americans. A year before this attack, so in 2020, he said, quote, "It is very important that we totally protect our Asian American community in the United States and all around the world." I don't think he realized what that meant. Did he really mean Asian Americans all around the world? I mean, there are Asian American expats all over the world, but does he know that? Or did he just mean Asian people? Anyway, he went on to say they are amazing people, and the spreading of the virus is not their fault in any way, shape, or form. But he also kept using rhetoric that the media had no problem calling inflammatory. After playing that quote just now from Jen Psaki, CBS discussed this.
I think one reason why we might not be hearing a lot from his party is because what we just heard from Jen Psaki. This is impossible to divorce from the former president and from, what role he may have played with his rhetoric. And then these Republicans have to, even if it's indirectly, criticize former President Trump. And that's something a lot of them aren't willing to do. But in this case, it seems like a no-brainer when you're talking about an entire group of Americans who are being attacked on a daily basis. And many of these Republican lawmakers also and continue to use phrases like Chinese virus, China flu, Wuhan flu.
So Trump said he did not want violence against Asian Americans, but also said those things that the media had no problem saying fueled dangers and violence against Asian Americans. The media is refusing to do this same thing for Mamdani. As I've reported on this show, hate crimes are down in America, except against Jewish people. Those have gone up, fueled by people who believe the genocide lie. Here's more from my conversation with Mike Pesca.
Yeah, I try to have intellectual consistency because I never excused what Trump was doing. But I always say, violent, either insane people, murderous people, evil people, they act how they act. And responsible people who talk a lot and get paid attention to should curtail their non-factual statements as such. But I think it's on the actors. However, if you were to be a truly ethical person in the world, you'd know that your messages will be received in a certain way. Mamdani, one of the core arguments of his campaign to try to brush back charges of anti-Semitism is to talk very, very, he would say, honestly and certainly moistly about how much he wants to protect the Jewish population. You're not doing it. If that's your intention, calling it genocide, which you can't stop yourself from doing, is definitely, and you need to know this, making them more vulnerable.
This bodes poorly for the entire country. The same national media that fixates on New York City's mayoral race, turning it into a national story, that same media also frames how millions of people understand national races. The more the mainstream media refuses to treat candidates equally, the more disastrous it becomes, and the fewer Americans have facts and clarity to understand the candidates. When news agencies dislike a candidate, they look at how the candidate's rhetoric and lies fuel violence against a minority group. When news agencies like a candidate, they refuse to do the same thing. This isn't journalism. How did things get this way? What happened that led news agencies to this point? It's a combination of active strategizing by certain groups and fear among those who should have stood guard. Mike and I discuss that coming up. Do you drink coffee I don't, but I do drink energy drinks. I know they're probably not great for me, but I started after a doctor I used to work with. We were both on air at CNN. I used to see him guzzling them. So I was like, it can't be that bad. Anyway, here's why I bring this up. I have been looking for the easiest possible way for listeners of this show to help support it without having to sign up for anything. So there is now a button you can click in the show notes or the newsletter called Buy Me a Coffee, except I changed it to energy drink. You could toss in $1 or, for a nice significant figure, $1.80 or $18, whatever you wish. Here's what I can promise you. Knowing that you are helping fuel this effort for truth-telling will give you more energy than a fancy, overpriced, double shot, whatever, from a coffee place. And supporting this show is way, way cheaper. You don't even have to give an email to support in this way. It's just a click. It's buymeacoffee.com/JoshLebs. Give yourself that percolating sense of joy and help me keep pouring you bottomless cups of truth. And while you're there, if you want to, you can toss in a request for this show as well. I'm here to serve. Is that enough coffee puns for this break? Coffee break! Let's see, Googling coffee puns. Oh, these are awful. I love you a latte. You mocha me crazy. Oh, I can't espresso how appreciative I am. Okay, that one's all right. Don't worry, be frappy? That doesn't even rhyme unless you pronounce it wrong. Buymeacoffee.com/JoshLebs. Thanks. When I put together this show, I always like to get you the most important, insightful bits. I really want to maximize your time. But you should know that I often do have fun moments along the way. Like, here's how I started this interview with Mike Pesca. Pesca! Il pescatore che mangia il pesce, come stai? My favorite Italian, Catholic, Jewish podcast host.
Bene grazie, Joshua.
Hey, well, that's good. How is your Italian?
You just heard all of it. I could order al dente, perhaps authentically.
Okay, so Mike was at NPR after I was. And back then, there were these expectations. People were expected to know the subject that they were covering and not go express opinions about things in public, especially not weighing in on things they're not covering.
And I think that's a bad thing that's happened with the media, and everyone has access to social media, that someone who works for the Washington Post can, by association, sully the reputation of the Post by popping off on something they don't know.
He's right. And it gets worse than that. I covered social media as it was developing and growing. And here's what happened inside news agencies. They, in the search for numbers, started encouraging their own journalists to get on social media and do engaging content. Well, what kind of content is engaging? Strong opinions. They started to take a look and say, oh, when this person did a tweet, it got this many retweets and likes, or a Facebook post got this many shares and likes, which is a ridiculous, useless metric. But they very much got caught up in the social media craze. So they stood by and let that happen as journalists became public activists. And news agencies also started hiring young people, saying, oh, these folks are digital natives. They know the tools. They know this new era where you jump on social media and create content. And they didn't care that that content wasn't fact-checked or researched. It was engaging. It got numbers. But let's get back to Mike. He wasn't talking about this part of it, but he was talking about young people with agendas being hired into news agencies.
People who should have been in management, the older people who had tenure under their belt, got scared. They knew maybe they're, in their late 40s and their 50s. I want to do this for 10 more years. I really could be bounced if I get on the wrong side of a very activist-oriented 20-year-old who the journalism schools were pumping out. So people who should have known better out of self-preservation didn't say anything. And we got a lot of, crazy stories on the air.
I'll tell you what I saw. I wonder if you did too. There was this creep over the years of that happening. And a lot of it had to do with colleges, universities, and journalism schools, with Qatar's investment and other investment, but people who support this far-left ideology and Islamist causes have figured out that they should infiltrate mainstream media. If you have people who you are indoctrinating starting at age 18, they bring their indoctrination with them into the news agency. So that was going on. But then the big thing was the 2016 election, when a lot of Americans and journalists especially had a trauma response because people did not see it coming. Trump was so obviously a liar. He said so many shocking things that were not normal. So it seemed that in the trauma response, a lot of journalistic rules went out the window. And all these people who were there were suddenly given free rein to push their ideologies. Did you see that?
That absolutely happened. And it was seen as the right thing to do. Many organizations, one I was in, one I used to be in, said this is an exceptional time and we have to make exceptions. Or it wasn't even debated. It was like, of course, to the ramparts.
At the same time as all this, there was also a growing and very weird skepticism of concrete truth. Like, oh, someone's experience is their truth. And that had real impacts inside newsrooms and in news executive C-suites, because some leaders were saying, well, if that's what this person says happened, then it's their truth. So sure, print it, air it, run with it, as though fact-checking wasn't relevant, which is crazy and the opposite of journalism. But yes, those kinds of conversations did happen.
I always said, you can't both say that there is global warming and the deniers are wrong, and also there is no truth. Like, those two things are incompatible.
I told Mike this one example that sticks out in my mind from early episodes of this show when then MSNBC host Joy Reid, quote unquote, interviewed the Queen of Jordan. And it was just a lie fest. Queen Rani had lied continuously. And I looked on social media at what Joy was hearing about that interview, and I saw that people were writing to Joy saying, oh, it's so great. You let the Queen speak her truth. I told Mike that.
Yes, Queen.
Yes, Queen. That's awesome. A continuous stream of lies is, in that view, a person's truth, and that makes it acceptable. Mike also had his own experience that is instructive. He launched his podcast, The Gist, at a news agency called Slate. And he was there for years and then was effectively fired, or as he puts it,
I would say that my continued employment proved to be impossible there.
The short version is this. There was a guy at the New York Times, Donald McNeil, a science reporter, who had had a conversation with a young person on a trip to another country. In that conversation, this guy from the Times was talking about the extremely offensive term, the N-word. And for clarity at one point in that discussion, he quoted the word. Well, skip ahead. Later on, someone complains that he had quoted that word. And that grows into a thing quickly with people at the Times demanding his head because he dared to quote that word in conversation. He was let go from the Times, effectively fired. When this happened, Mike was at Slate. There, the staff had an internal Slack channel, a messaging system, in which people discussed all kinds of issues in the news.
So one day on the media channel, everyone was saying, I think this is true, literally everyone who expressed an opinion said McNeil needs to go. And I, perhaps gently, said, I don't think he needs to go. I don't know that this is a firing offense. And I was, rebutted or deluged. And I posted a link to what's called the use mentioned distinction. John McWhorter, the linguist, who also had been doing a Slate podcast for years and years and years. So a colleague has written about, talked about, he didn't invent it, but there is using a slur and just mentioning a slur. They did not want to hear that. It was not accepted at that time in early 2021. This was not an opinion they could countenance.
I have this belief in the presumption of best intentions. So you find out that someone did a thing before you rush to say, oh, I'm so offended. What was the person's intention? Were they teaching someone about this in that case? Look, I've had conversations with people and I have never met a person who actually thinks that there are zero white people who can ever utter those syllables in any context. What if you are playing a racist person in a movie? Well, then it's okay. What if you are narrating the audiobook of To Kill a Mockingbird? Well, then it's okay. There were people who gave statements at the time where they said, oh, it's not too much to ask that we as Black people not only not hear that word, but not hear white people weighing in on it. And journalistically, that is actually a massive thing to ask, because no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, no matter what body you're in, as a journalist, you're supposed to be able to talk about any topic, to discuss any topic. And the idea that someone would face career punishment for referring as a quote to a word in the news is such an obvious overreach, and it creates a culture of fear in which people decide that when people from certain groups say they're offended, you absolutely must bend over and give them everything they want. And then you have given up on standing for your people, on creating a journalistic, ethical, editorial backbone, on having real conversations, on having real respect for people at all. And it contributes to this mood in which basic journalistic standards don't apply. Do you see it that way?
Yes, but creating a culture of fear, as you talked about it, is a terrible consequence of all this. I would submit that maybe that was the goal of many people all along. Or you talked about the presumption of goodwill. Well, you wouldn't have that presumption if what you're going for is not an open society that is based on the free exchange of ideas. If what you're going for is to expunge thinkers, people of a demographic, but also a certain thought pattern, or just to express power in the moment.
Some people started complaining that years earlier he had used the actual word as a quote, but he points out that at the time that was the policy. Anyway, suddenly people were calling for him to be fired for just saying that he didn't think the Times guy had to be fired, not even for mentioning the word or using the euphemism, quote, the N-word, unquote, not even that. And as with other stuff, people who knew better were too afraid to say anything.
Many people were holding their tongues. And remember, the dynamic of my situation was one guy at the New York Times says the word and really does get pushed out, all right, for saying the word. Then another guy commenting on that guy pretty much does lose his livelihood, his job, his status, his reputation. You're going to be the third person in, right? What's the incentive structure to comment on me, commenting on him, when everyone along the line has had their heads chopped off?
He ended up launching The Gist independently. Now, here's something you should know. That conversation Mike and I just had, we couldn't have that in big mainstream media. It wouldn't happen because people would say, oh, you're both white. How dare you even talk about that topic at all? But that's not journalism. First of all, race is a social construct, and what counts as white isn't even clear and changes all the time. When I gave a speech earlier this year, a government official came up to me afterwards. He's Black and not Jewish. And he said to me, when did Jews become white? They were never white when I was growing up. And I explained that whatever the bad thing is at any given time, that's what Jews get called. So when it was bad to be poor, Jews were the poor Jews. Now it's bad to be rich, so Jews are rich. It used to be bad not to be white, so Jews were not white. Now it's bad to be white, so Jews are white. That's just how it works. Anyway. There I am, fact-checking even what I just said about what people would say. Okay, back on track here. So, in journalism, you have to be able to talk about whatever the topics are. The way that news agencies should operate is by putting respect first and applying rules to everyone. But believe it or not, I hold on to hope, and so can you. I'll tell you why, coming up. The other day in the newsletter, I used an image. I said it can feel like we are in this dark storm with heavy winds and rain coming at us from left and right, politically, metaphorically, literally, left and right. But then there are moments when it's like you see a lighthouse and you think, maybe we can get to that solid ground right there. You might feel that way right now. You might be looking for solid ground. That gets me to why I created They Stand Corrected in the first place. If I thought we had no shot at getting through all this, I wouldn't be doing this. This show exists because we can get there. Just as the media was steered in a bad direction, it can be steered in a good direction. Just as politics have been steered in a bad direction, they can be steered in a good direction. The key is not left versus right madness. The key is putting truth first always. Facts plus context. I can tell you, people have come to this show from the left and the right. I hear from people who have in the past been on one side or the other. This is a place in which we can come together. But I need your help. When you send this show to one person and encourage them to subscribe, you help so much. When you rate and review it on whatever platform you're listening to on, you help so much. And if you fuel it financially, if you choose to become a paid subscriber or make a contribution or whatever, every penny goes into making this show possible. And you get some rewards for it. I'm so grateful to everyone who has been doing that. We can move forward. To do so, we have to show everyone that when it comes to the media, they stand corrected. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you on the usual day next week.